Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for our webinar series, Education and Research in the COVID-19 Era. My name is Fiona Morris, and I am the Counsellor, Education and Science at the Australian High Commission here in Malaysia. I work for the Australian Department of Education, Skills and Employment, and my office in the Australian High Commission is responsible for enhancing collaboration between Australia and Malaysia in the area of research and education. Our key partners here in Malaysia are the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Higher Education. It has been a real pleasure for us to work with the Ministry of Higher Education to develop this series of 5 webinars exploring how the pandemic has impacted education and research. Some of you may have joined us for one or more of our other webinars. The first 2 webinars yesterday focused on quality assurance and then evaluation, assessment and integrity in online higher education. And this morning's webinar focused on online learning and teaching in the TVET and polytechnic sectors in both Malaysia and Australia. Recordings of the webinars will be made available once the webinar series concludes tomorrow. We are very pleased to have you join us now for webinar 4, which will provide perspectives on sustaining research and collaboration during the COVID-19 pandemic. I will be moderating today's webinar. So I will be introducing our panelists and moderating the question and answer session at the end of the presentations. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A chat box. This is separate and different from the normal chat box. We will monitor the Q&A chat and I will ask the panelists these questions at the end of all of the 4 presentations. I would now like to introduce our first speaker for today, Professor Paula Moynihan. Professor Moynihan is Director of Food and Health in the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at the University of Adelaide. She is also Academic Coordinator for the University's Industry Engagement Priority in Health and Medical Industries. She is an internationally renowned researcher in the field of nutrition and oral health. Professor Moynihan is a public health nutritionist, and her research focuses on the interrelationship between nutrition and oral health over the life course. Professor Moynihan's research has aligned with the work program of the World Health Organization, the WHO, and she has served as an expert advisor to the WHO Nutrition Guideline Advisory Group, subgroup on diet and health, and her research into sugars and tooth decay underpin the WHO guideline on sugars intake. Over to you, Professor Moynihan. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real honour to be a panel member in this webinar today, and I'm going to be talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on research, and I'm going to focus on public health and clinical research. And over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to briefly summarise the research collaborations between the University of Adelaide and universities in Malaysia before moving on to discuss the impact of the pandemic on health and medical research. And then I'm going to consider how research from the University of Adelaide is contributing to mitigating the impacts of COVID-19 and directing our way out of the pandemic. And then last but not least, I'm going to touch upon how we can sustain research through the pandemic and beyond. So the University of Adelaide's Malaysian alumni is our oldest alumni cohort. And this graph shows the number of PhD students that we have from Malaysia that we have at the University of Adelaide over the last 5 years or so. And we've had a steady number, and it's important to us that we improve and maintain these numbers throughout the pandemic and beyond. The number of Malaysian institutions that have co-authored papers with researchers from the University of Adelaide has actually increased over the last 5 years. In fact, over that period, we've had over 200 co-authored publications from 25 different Malaysian universities. And this graph shows the number of co-authored publications over the last 5 years. And actually in 2020, the number of co-authored publications was up. It seems that there was more opportunity to write up during the lockdown, And we hope that this strong publication record continues from our ongoing and future collaborations. Because the lockdown and pandemic have had many practical ramifications for research, a survey conducted by Research Australia of health and medical researchers throughout the country showed that many researchers were redeployed to work on COVID-19, and this through many existing projects, of course. Research was not high on the agenda of many clinicians who were really challenged with providing those essential services during that period. And the Research Australia survey showed that almost half of those who said that they were impacted by the pandemic said that they would be unable to finish current projects. Moreover, COVID-19 restrictions have meant that there's been limited access to research participants, and also there's been limited access to research sites such as hospitals, clinics, schools and aged care. And all of this leads to delays and has cost implications. And this slide here shows the data from the Research Australia study, and it shows that over 50% said that they were unable to do their research remotely. Almost 50% were unable to recruit participants. Over 40% had no means of interacting with their study participants. And almost 40% said that the travel restrictions had interrupted or halted their research. Then 36% couldn't get access to the study site or the setting. And 35% of had limitations because PhD students weren't there to contribute to the hands-on data collection because many returned to their home countries at the start of the pandemic. And then there was interruption to research because we had to, for many of us that teach and do research, we had to switch all our teaching online, and that took time, and that time was at the expense of research. And then there was over 20% couldn't get access to hospital sites for research. Over 10% of clinical researchers were assigned non-research clinical duties, and around 6% couldn't get access to aged care facilities for research. And around 70% of those surveyed felt that the impacts of research were going to be more longer term. Almost 90% reported that there would be delays to their research milestones, and over 80% said that there would be delays to publishing their research data. And of course, this is going to lead to a reduction in overall publications. Over 60% felt that research funding would become tighter, and almost 50% said that they felt that they would be losing research staff, and of course, therefore, the capacity to do research. So what are some of the specific impacts on public health and epidemiological research? Epidemiological lifestyle surveys are affected because one might obtain atypical results if you were collecting these data during a global pandemic. And there were also restrictions to accessing certain study populations. Even when the surveys can go ahead, there are many restrictions because COVID has meant that we have had to collect data in a different way. In person has quite often shifted to online, and this might actually also impact the way that participants respond to research. We've also had restrictions to the type of variables that can be collected. It's not always appropriate or acceptable to ask participants to post samples, collect them themselves and post them, or to take photographs and send them. Our participants lose that personal contact with the researcher, and we know from our research that that's so important for retention of participants in this type of research. We then know that new tools may need to be developed. Some have been already, but new tools to support online data collection. And of course, we need resources to develop and try and test these new tools. And moreover, these methodological changes in approaches, especially in ongoing research, necessitate amendments to approval, including ethical approval, and that causes considerable delays. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on clinical trials worldwide, and a paper that was published in Trials earlier this year noted that there was a reduction in the number of new trials starting. In the USA, it was only 50% of the usual level, and for the rest of the world, 77% of the usual level. At the University of Adelaide, bridging funds were used to help keep randomised controlled trials afloat while the health system was severely impacted. And worldwide, we know that for ongoing trials, enrolments were decreased or put on hold. And now what is seen throughout the world is that fewer participants are volunteering to take part in trials. Moreover, sometimes data collection is incomplete. Sometimes people can't come to sites to have measurements taken, for example, medical imaging, and in other instances, it's difficult to collect certain data remotely. And then we have between country differences in the impacts, the wave of lockdown and reopening occurring at different times in different countries. And this is going to cause complications for analysis from trials that are conducted in many different countries in international trials. Therefore, at best, the pandemic has caused delays, but in some instances, it can entirely undermine research projects. For some projects that were put on hold, there may not be any opportunity to restart them at a later date due to difficulty in retaining staff. In Australia, a one-off federal government payment's been an absolute lifesaver and helped to sustain research in the short term. And in South Australia, the state government has provided support for our overseas students, and the University of Adelaide has conducted significant fundraising to try and support our international students during this difficult time. But overall, there's been a need for greater flexibility and amenability of funders to changes not only to project milestones, but also to project deliverables. However, on a positive note, we've seen that the pandemic has led to improved collaborations both within and outside research organisations, especially for research to help find ways out of the pandemic. And in Australia, more research funding was made available from the Commonwealth, state and territory governments for COVID-19 research. And researchers from the University of Adelaide are collaborating as an important part of Australia's response to COVID-19 and efforts to mitigate its impact. University of Adelaide immunologists, virologists and clinicians are working in a statewide collaboration looking at COVID-19 responses, the treatments and the impacts on long-term immunity. Professor Caroline Miller from our School of Public Health is conducting evidence synthesis in real time to inform COVID-19 policy in response to questions from our state government's Chief Scientific Officer. And Professor Tracy Merlin in our Health Technology Assessment Unit contributed to the Group of 8 COVID-19 Roadmap to Recovery report, which informed Australian federal government's COVID Safe plan. Researchers from our university are also exploring how to monitor the COVID-19 outbreak within water distribution systems. And work led by Professor Zhang is exploring mental health issues and predictors in adult workers during COVID-19. And this will help health services rapidly screen and respond to those workers who are most at risk. Now, during the pandemic, the dissemination of research and networking has been severely impacted. In 2020, many conferences were cancelled, and unfortunately, many researchers have missed out on the opportunity to disseminate their research, but also to network or to conduct internships that are associated with traditional conferences. And research organisations have moved to virtual and hybrid conferences. Some organisations have held more regular online forums and webinars, and that's been fantastic because we can stay in touch more regularly. And these online dissemination modes have benefited many researchers for whom traditionally travelling to conferences was challenging or prohibitively expensive. So we have had some positive outcomes. Now, I realise that my time is just about probably running out, and I'm going to draw my presentation to a close by briefly considering how we can build and maintain research and collaborations through the pandemic and beyond. Because collaboration is the lifeblood of research, and closing of international borders has undoubtedly impacted in the short term. However, we can use what we've learned to collaborate differently. In the short term, researchers are focused on writing up their research and planning, but there are also many opportunities in the public health and epidemiological areas to exploit opportunities for secondary data analysis, including cross-country collaborations and using data for modelling studies, for example. And we've seen that there are some efficiencies to collecting data virtually. And I think that this is here to stay, but we need to develop and validate new tools for data collection and explore these new approaches. And I believe we'll be hearing more about this in the next presentation from Professor Ben. The economic recovery from the pandemic is undoubtedly going to impact research funding, but we must remember that supporting science is actually key. It's a key factor to that recovery. And we need funding to sustain collaborations and also to help us to work in these new ways together virtually. Over the last 18 months, we have changed the way we work, and we are open to collaborating and communicating in new and different ways. Now is the time really to think outside the box, to rise to the challenges we face as we aim to build new and strengthen existing collaborations between our countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Moynihan. Many challenges, particularly for the health and medical research sector, with the very severe impact on the health systems around the world. But great to see the responses to some of the opportunities that have come up through the pandemic. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Professor Patrick Ben. He is a professor at Swinburne University of Technology, Sarawak, here in Malaysia, and director of the Sarawak Development Institute. Professor Patrick heads the School of Information and Communication Technologies at Swinburne University in Sarawak and the Health Informatics Cluster at Swinburne Melbourne Data Science Institute. He is the founder and director of Swinburne Sarawak's Digital Innovation Precinct and Centre for Digital Futures. He is a thought leader in health informatics and digital health research and development. His recent research in digital health was selected as one of 5 Asia-Pacific representations to be presented at the inaugural Digital Summit by the European Society of Cardiology in Estonia in October 2019. He demonstrated translational research from fundamental research to solving real-life cardiac challenges faced by clinicians and patients. He has established his unique partnership in both research and entrepreneurial projects with healthcare service providers from both public and private sectors over more than a decade. His research in digital health has spanned across chronic disease management, especially in cardiology and diabetes, to public health management, notably COVID-19 surveillance and management. And of course, that's an important topic that has been getting a lot of attention over the last 18 months. Professor Patrick, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Share my screen. A very good afternoon to every participants, and also thank you for the invitation. Today I would like to share with you my digital health research pre-COVID and during COVID. We have not got a chance to talk about post-COVID yet, where I also would like to share with you a little bit of my roles and responsibility across some multidisciplinary other than computer science and digital futures, no conflict of interest. This is a very brief introductions. A lot of all of us understand very well doctor-patient relationship, where we use a lot of mobile apps or a website to manage our bank accounts, and this is very well defined and also trusted by users like us. But in health industry, doctor-patient relationship has yet to be as trustworthy as it is if it is going fully digital. So aging population also pose a challenge to every one of us, either in digital health or in the health practicing industry. Recent success in Malaysia is we can see MySejahtera, a mobile app that was widely used for contact tracing, vaccination. What I would like to say here is that digital platform or digital apps is very, very useful and flexible, especially it capable to be personalized to match to conform to policies of a country or of any entity. So we'd like to share with you what was my experience before COVID-19 in Malaysia context, which is before March 2020 last year, and during COVID-19 pandemic, which is from March until now. In pre-COVID, as we can see, the area of research has been quite diverse. With digital health research is always slightly at the back seat, not at the very first front seat in terms of acceptance. When we see MCO in Malaysia and lockdown in Malaysia and COVID in Malaysia, we can see that digital health become a priority area, especially with specific interest in COVID-19. And what I can see that there are a lot more other opportunities that arise because of COVID and all the special circumstances or situation or conditions that only happen during the pandemic time. Just the snapshots of what my team have done in the past 13 years. If you can see 28 to 2018, this is the very first 10 to 11 years. You can see roughly there are like 10 boxes here. More or less is the notable research projects and publication that we have done in that period of 11 years. But if you can see from 2019 to 2021, our team's digital health journey actually also, as you can see, we have like 11 boxes here. So in a short period of time of 2 years plus, we managed to accomplish even more than what we have accomplished in the very first 11 years. Which to me, this represents a lot of opportunities in this COVID era, despite a lot of challenges along the line. I'd like to share with you 4 stars projects here that we have rolled out in the past 1 year until now. First, this was a stay-home notice surveillance for person under investigation, and this was the very first apps that we roll out with the support of the university alone, without any public funding, to be used by public sector and private entities as early as end of March last year. These apps users total about 3,000 people they have used these apps, and they found it very, very useful, especially during that time. That is before MySejahtera app. Second project I would like to share with you is a corpusal detection and identification for lung disease inclusive of COVID-19, where we are collaborating with the National Institutes of Health on this arena, where we found that using RTK or PCR or any type of swab test, the cost is almost unbearable by most organizations at scale. So this corpusal detection potentially can be used as a population-wide epidemiology research, where every user like us can just use our mobile phone, record our corpusal, and upload to the server. And the AI algorithms on the server will identify whether this is a suspicious lung disease, COVID-19 or not. If yes, then there will be a second or third verification process by the ministry or by any healthcare service provider. Third project that we have come up with is a remote home blood pressure monitoring system, where users can just use their normal blood pressure monitor at home and synchronize the blood pressure readings to a cloud server, and this cloud server automatically share or synchronize data to the healthcare service providers such as doctors, clinics, or hospitals. And from there, real-time monitoring by the apps, where can give automatic alerts or alarms to the healthcare service provider should any blood pressure go beyond any threshold. The fourth project that we have managed to roll out is remote home. Home intentionally is meant for home, but during COVID time, it is meant for COVID patient to be monitored their body temperature in a hospital setting or at home, so that frontliner do not have to monitor their body temperature too frequently. That will reduce the frequency of contacts between healthcare frontliners and COVID-19 patients. So that was the four projects that are especially that we have done in the past less than 2 years' time because of COVID, and we are very happy that our users are very happy with the system and found very useful for them. The next thing I would like to share is about funding, where before pre-COVID, in Malaysia context, national competitive grants by the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation, and Ministry of Higher Education are widely available. During pandemic, when economic growth rates is a bit of a struggle, funding started to decline, and that push additional financial stress or constraints to researchers. Professor Paula shares now, pre-COVID, everyone have a chance to meet each other face to face in conferences, meetings, seminars, and so on. But in pandemic time, every one of us are forced to meet each other virtually or online. But in my thoughts, this actually gives a lot more reachability without geographical barriers, and definitely less carbon footprint because less travel, less emission of CO2. But the downside is it's harder to build rapport or make new friends. So before COVID, we feel that we are busy, not only busy with work, but also busy commuting. Since COVID on lockdowns, we feel even busier. Even though we have less or zero commutes, job-related one. And many of my friends, including myself, found that it is difficult to define or put a line between work life. So it's harder to make our life or life out of work at home, especially when you have young kids. So in my very humble opinion, that COVID-19 lockdowns represents or give more opportunities as well as threats, and that can be a new norm moving forward in future, and life move on definitely. So it's a matter of whether we would like to innovate and strive, or we keep the status quo and wait. So that's my humble sharing with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patrick. It's great to see that digital health is now taking more of a front seat in conversations, both nationally and globally. For those of us here in Malaysia, I know that the MySejahtera app is going to be increasingly important for those of us who are vaccinated and who want to maybe have dinner outside or to go shopping. It's fantastic that we now have the opportunity to do that with a digital vaccination certificate. And yes, your insights on the blurring of lines, I think, between work and personal life as we all work from home is a very important one and quite challenging, I think, for everyone. Thank you very much. I am now going to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Nathan Absalom. I know Nathan from a previous role I had working with him at the Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Sydney. Nathan is an Australian Research Council Research Associate at the University of Sydney. He is a national leader in the fields of pharmacogenomics and neuropharmacology. He is a National Health and Medical Research Council funded laboratory scientist at the University of Sydney and currently works in the large collaborative project including basic science and clinical groups at the Danish Epilepsy Centre at Philadelphia Hospital and the Florey Institute in Melbourne. His work includes investigating the genetic causes of severe rare epilepsies, adverse events to anti-epileptic treatments, and the development of precision medicine approaches. He has worked at the University of Sydney for the last 10 years after completing a Wellcome Trust postdoctoral training research fellowship at the University of Oxford and the Medical Research Council in Harwell. Thank you very much, Dr. Absalom. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Fiona. That was a lovely introduction. I'll just share my screen, and thanks to everybody for logging in to the webinar. I haven't done any webinars before, so this is a bit new for me. So I'll be talking about how we sustained our research and collaborations during the COVID-19 pandemic, but I'll focus a lot on what happened to our research students, because as far as I'm concerned, that was where the most profound effects occurred. And while I think we could say nobody could have predicted this pandemic coming along, what the pandemic did is actually highlighted a lot of the deficiencies and the problems that were there but were never addressed, and how our institute is going to try and address those, and you know, how other institutes can address those challenges as well, particularly with international students. So just about my work, as Fiona mentioned, I work in a large multinational research project which is aimed at improving the treatment of genetic epilepsies. So in the last 5 years, this whole field has really exploded due to whole genome sequencing. So now if an infant or a child has seizures, they have their whole genome sequenced, and we identify that single genetic cause of their disease, which causes their epilepsies. The thing with this field, though, is that the genetic variants in each particular gene are actually really rare. So what that means is that we necessarily have to have a worldwide collaboration. There are just not enough patients in any country in the world for you to get meaningful data to do your research. So what this means is that we have our program set up where we have our precision medicine approach that starts with the clinician. Then we have clinical geneticists aggregating the information, so that happens in Denmark. And then we do functional work to demonstrate whether the variant works, and so whether the variant causes this disorder. And then we have other areas which look at mouse models and try and decipher which drug would be best to use for these children. So this is very new, but as I said, is really, really dependent on international collaborations for it to work. So we started going quite well, getting our research up and going, our collaborations formed, and then COVID-19 hit. And our experiences, so were probably not so bad. So even though we were completely dependent on our collaborations, we found, first of all, that our grant funding wasn't affected. So because we're externally funded from Novo Nordisk and the NHMRC, we had no financial disruptions. And that was a bit different to other research groups in the university that were reliant on discretionary funding from the university or funding per student that they had to keep going. So we were okay for that. And we found that there was a little bit of a disruption to the productivity due to the shutdowns. So right now we can't do any work in our Sydney labs at the moment. And our collaborators in Melbourne weren't able to go to their lab for, I think it was 114 days or something along those lines. But because we communicate well and because we have different groups doing different things and because the work isn't linear, we're not waiting for somebody, there's not a hold up, our milestones didn't really get pushed back very much at all. And the other thing that was really advantaged is that beforehand, I think people didn't use Zoom or didn't use Skype or didn't use those tools very often. Now, because we have to use it all the time and it's second nature, it actually really strengthened the collaborations. The meetings were more consistent. They were much more productive. They were much better structured and they worked really well. So far as the research is concerned, although we couldn't do this indefinitely, we haven't been so affected. The research staff we've had have been brilliant. They've all been very flexible. We've also been aware, some obviously have families and have difficulties when schools are closed and when childcare centres are closed, and that happens. But everybody's generally been flexible and productive, and I think that comes because everybody believes in what we're trying to achieve with the project, that everybody can be flexible and continue to work and continue to push for what we want. However, as I said, the biggest problem we saw was with research students, and that was both in our lab and within our collaborative networks, and also, the students that we interact with every day on our floor. So this happened for both postgraduate and honours students. So this year our honours students are not allowed to go into the lab at all, and they have to do a different project, which is very challenging. So it's a massive upheaval. But the international students were the most heavily affected, and some of the stories that come through are not very good. Some of them landed on their feet, but some of them had severe interruptions that I think if it was structured better in the first place, it wouldn't have happened. And I think there's really good potential to implement some changes, which our university is doing, so that doesn't happen again for whatever reason. So I just thought I'd go through a couple of case studies of a couple of students for what worked well and what didn't. And really each example here is trying to push home a point. And so the point of this first student is the importance of having strong networks of groups in the same field, in your broad area of what you want to do. So one of the students that we took on, we took a PhD student in Denmark, and her project was originally to come to Sydney to learn what we did here and to generate results functionally, and then go back to Denmark and try and correlate what she saw with the results here with the patient data. Unfortunately, no sooner had she enrolled and the borders were closed and she was unable to come out to Australia to do this work. The problem is that our facilities are quite critical, not unique, but unusual. So we work with these lovely little frogs called xenopus, and we use their oocytes to make electrophysiological recordings. So you need a specialised animal house. In Australia, because they're imported, we have a lot of quarantine regulations around them as well. And worse still, we kind of jerry-rig a bit of our equipment. So our equipment's not necessarily bought off the shelf. You can't send your samples to somewhere and get it run. And so there's not many places in the world that have similar equipment to us to be able to do what you wanted to do. Luckily though, we have friends and we have people who owe us favours, and now we have people who we owe favours to. And they were able to secure the training and space in an alternative laboratory in Denmark, so she could do it where she was. So this is a success story. She's able to do what she's able to do. She didn't get to stay in Australia, but her project continued. And that's because we had a strong network of groups in the same field. Those groups that you meet at conferences work well and we're able to find a solution. The second example is a student that came from China. So he was an honours student and he completed his placement in Sydney, and he did very well, and decided he wanted to stay and do a PhD. He went back after he applied for the Moon Festival, and unfortunately, the borders were closed while he was awaiting the outcome, and he wasn't able to get back to Sydney. So by the time he was offered his PhD, it was pretty clear that this was going to go on for longer than a few months. It was going to go on, for a year or so. And so after talking to him and talking to the supervisors that he had in China before he came off to Sydney, we were able to get him to a project that he still wanted to do, which was quite different, but he was happy to do it and undertake that PhD in China. And so he's doing that successfully now. And that, again, that's a nice story. So he still gets the opportunity that he gets. And the important thing here, though, is that the pre-existing institutional arrangements are critical in these situations. Now, we've had students from Malaysia in the past that have had similar setups where I think, not identical, but I think it was a scholarship from Malaysia that allowed the student to study in Sydney. And when you have those types of arrangements, I think they're really important when something goes wrong, because there's that support network both in their home country and in Australia for them to be able to get what they want out of it. And there's lots of things that can go wrong, more than just a pandemic. And so those strong institutional networks are really important. Now, the third and fourth cases are where there are no contingencies. So here's the issue of when you're taking a student or you advise a student to go to Australia and just do it sort of thing, which a lot of PhD students do. But there are no real contingencies, either formal or informal. So this looks at two students from China that did a PhD. One had begun second year, so they'd learned the techniques, but not done anything productive with those techniques, so they weren't able to publish. And another had begun her first year, so she was just starting to learn techniques. They went home for different reasons. So one went home over the Christmas period for the Moon Festival to see her family, and the border closed on her. The other one, and we saw this, and I think you'll hear plenty of stories like this where there was family pressures on the other students. So they heard that COVID-19 was starting to spread in Australia, and are very concerned for their student. And he managed to get, I think it was the second last flight back home to China before the flight stopped. To get back home and sort of wait out the crisis was his idea. The trouble was that there was no institutional arrangements between any home institution for them in China, and no arrangements that we had between any laboratories that were similar in China. So they were left in limbo. One of them deferred for a while, then wrote a review, and now is in limbo, not knowing what to do. And the other one has simply deferred a couple of times and still, is no further along. And I think, these are really difficult situations. So these are students that end up through no fault of their own with a project that may or may not proceed. And I think it's a terrible situation, and it's one that we should try to avoid, even though it is a global pandemic. So putting that back into a bit of context, international collaboration is really, really important in Australia. I think Paula already showed some of the statistics, and nationwide, about 55% of our papers are co-authored by international collaborators. It's absolutely essential for us to have the research capacity that we want to have international collaboration. We just can't do it any other way. National students also make up a huge part of that. So we have 43,000 in 2018. There was 43,000 domestic PhD students and 23,000 international students. So almost a third, or more than a third, sorry, of international students. So this is really a big issue for Australia, because our question is, after COVID, well, what do we do to change? What can we change? Because we want to maintain these same beneficial relationships with international students. So we don't want some of these situations to occur that have occurred. So some of the problems are, I alluded to this earlier, that the really large cuts to discretionary budgets also disproportionately affected research students. So there are lots of groups that were dependent on small amounts of funds from the university, and they went to projects that students did, or we'd have little grants that students did, and that money is not there at the moment. So what our university has done, and I think other universities will go along the same lines, is that at the point of enrolment, stricter controls have to be introduced. And so it has to be defined what the finance is and how it's going to be to ensure that student will be able to continue their project all the way through. And this is particularly important in biomedical sciences. The second is the streamlined recruitment process. So prior to COVID, we had some recruitment processes which were very formal and some which were very ad hoc. So academics might have utilised networks, advertisements, and sometimes even unsolicited contacts were used for recruitment. And I think our university certainly felt that the more formal the procedures were and the better the procedures were bedded down, the better and more likely the students were to have a good experience, and particularly during COVID. So our faculty has started to implement a centralised form of recruitment. So it doesn't mean you can't contact, your academic, or your academic can't utilise networks, but at some point you have to take the student back to the faculty-based recruitment. They have to ensure that the entry standards are high enough. They also look to give students greater choice, so introduce them to the other things that are going around at the university and see if they may, want to take part in some exciting science they hadn't considered. And hopefully this produces better experiences for the students. And I think, from my experience worldwide, sometimes what you do early and the way that's supported for the students has huge benefits later on. So I think that really will work well. So just summing it up, and I think if there's one sort of thing I want to leave, it's this, and it's the contingency plans. So our university now wants us to have appropriate contingency plans specified at the beginning of the project, and that's an excellent idea because, yeah, right, we couldn't predict a global pandemic, but you can predict that for somebody, something's going to go wrong. Somebody's going to have a personal problem along the way. Some circumstance is going to have to change, and so you have to have those contingency plans. But if you step back and look at it whole, sort of, what I want to bring, the changes that we're making will benefit projects where either groups have a strong association between themselves, or two institutions will have a strong association. So if your university is providing, say, a scholarship for a student to spend part of their time in Australia and go back to Malaysia, for instance, those are the sorts of projects that are going to go well. They went well during COVID, and they'll go well after COVID, and that's sort of what we want. So on that, thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Absalom. That was very interesting. I think it's been a very challenging period for many international students around the world. I certainly hope that as every country around the world increases its vaccinations, that we'll be able to get to a stage where we can welcome international students back to Australia, where international students can travel globally and, as you say, complete those kinds of PhDs where they're able to do some work overseas, some work at their home institution. I think that would be fantastic. I think it's very interesting also that one of the outcomes has been a centralised application process for research students. I think that's a great outcome also. And as you say, I think that will lead to better student experiences. Thank you very much. I'm now going to introduce our final panellist. So Professor Dr. Siti Khartoum Kamarudin. Professor Dr. Siti has been a Professor of Chemical Engineering at the Department of Chemical and Process Engineering at the University Kebangsaan, Malaysia since 2011, and is now the Director of the Fuel Cell Institute at University Kebangsaan, Malaysia. She is a world expert in low carbon energy related to fuel cell and hydrogen technology. In 2017, Professor Dr. Siti was awarded the Malaysia Research Star Award for Outstanding National Research in the area of renewable energy, sustainable and environment energy by Thomson Reuters and the Ministry of Education. Professor Dr. Siti is also active in promoting the fuel cell and hydrogen technology at the national level. She is currently working closely with various local industries and agencies in establishing the Hydrogen Economy Roadmap in Malaysia. And she is a key advisor on several projects in developing policy and codes for application of fuel cell and hydrogen technology in Malaysia. Over to you, Dr. Siti. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for your kind introduction. I'll share my slides. Okay, hi, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Nice to be here today. And thanks for the organizer for inviting me for this session. So as an introduction, I'm the current director of Fuel Cell Institute. I'm from University of Malaysia. So I'll give you some background about my institute before proceeding to the title today. So Fuel Cell Institute was established in UKM since 2006, and the first research institute focusing on hydrogen and fuel cell technology. So we have vision to be the world-class center for fuel cell and hydrogen technology and energy policy and management. So the mission of this fuel cell is to explore the frontier of knowledge in science, engineering policy, and economy of fuel cell and hydrogen energy, and develop world-class indigenous fuel cell and hydrogen technology on sustainable energy policy management. So maybe everyone was asking what is fuel cell? Basically, fuel cell actually is a device that converts chemical energy into electrical energy. So basically, if you can see here, we can see there are some catalysts and also membrane involved, right? And basically, the application of fuel cell system is like depending on the power output. It varies from the small powers to the bigger power application, from like portable electronics and also for auxiliary powers and also military and aerospace. So if you can see here, the research very much involved in very fundamental research, like developing novel catalysts and membranes. So we in institute, we have 7 main areas that is focusing on, liquid fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell, solid oxide fuel cell, biohydrogen, fuel processing, producing hydrogen from solar fuel cell, and also some fundamental research that related to catalysts and novel membranes. As for now, we have 71 active students, right? And basically overall, the postgraduates in UKM, we have about 10,700 students, where about 700 is from the PhD, and the rest is on masters and also other courses. So you can see that we have like really involved in research and also publications. So I'll give you some 2 scenarios how the pandemic has affected our research. So we can see that we have 2 scenarios. The first one's during the total lockdown and also movement control order, right? So in Malaysia, when the total lockdown was announced, all the labs in the institution have to be closed, except for some essential services. And this essential services is referred to the services that related to ICT and also some hospital, right? So the research in our lab is totally closed. So when we observe, the most affected area in the lab is the biological cells research. We did just now, 3 of the speakers were talking about the health and medical, but in our chemical engineering area, we also dealing with live cells for like microbes and mixed cultures, right? So what happens is that this research are totally stopped, and what they have to do is to regrow the culture. And as we know, to regrow the culture, it takes like 3 to 6 months, right? So on the science and technology research area, we can work partially, right? So some of the research that related to labs has to be totally closed, but then research that related to design and simulation can still be carried out at home, right? However, the simulation also related to the software that we want to use. So some of the softwares we can directly install in our PC at home, but some of them we have to go to the university, right? So it depends on the types of modeling and design work that we are doing, right? From the science social perspective of view, partially affected, they still can go on with their like developing their modules, their framework, but then maybe they are affected in terms of to present their research in the real case or in situ situation, right? So what happens is that we get delayed in the achieving the milestone of the research. And the one most affected is the students. So the delay in terms of graduation. In fact, last year, we don't have any graduation, and we bring it to this year, and most probably we are going to have 2 batches graduation for this year, right? So some of them need to quit from their research work because they cannot afford to pay their fee, right? Some converts to part-time studies, and this makes them to have less focus on their research, and also giving problems to the researchers to achieve the KPIs. So, but then we got no choice to allow the student to convert or to quit, because we know as the pandemics have, really affect their life, right? So during the movement control order, basically we are allowed to open the labs, right? Based on the attendance for 20%, 40%, and also 70%. On the last pandemic, that was like in 2020, we have reached the 70% of attendance to the lab. However, for this second pandemic, right, the third wave in Malaysia, we are still at 40% for the entry of the students, right? So what happens is that the student get lesser time to be in the lab, right? Maybe roughly about 2 to 3 days per week, okay? And we have to open the lab for longer period of time. In fact, on the weekdays, we open the lab starting from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. So this to allow more students to go into the lab at very restricted numbers, right? So what we did is that we are only allowed 3 students per lab for a time. Right? So we can have like 2 sessions, that is in the morning and also after the working hours. In fact, we got a support from the university to open the labs during the weekends. That is about 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So these are some of the initiatives that given by the University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and they allow us to do longer period for research. And we also get support from the funder, like the institutional and also the ministries to replan our milestone. Okay, so this was so great for their support, and the researcher starts to replan, and they are giving some times of extension 3 to 9 months. So however, still we having delay in getting results analysis from the lab, as we know the time limited for the equipment operated at certain center, because we are dealing directly with some very major analysis until because developing catalyst and membrane, we have to go for very tidy analysis and also proof in order for us to do a good publication, right? So we are really dependent to some equipments that is not placed in our lab, but we have to go to other labs or other places to get the data, right? So besides that, it also delay getting the outputs like technical publications, IP, human capital, and PhD students, right? So however, although we have faced many problems, but we can see some positive trend, observe some positive trend in UKM, particularly in publication trend. As mentioned by Prof. Paula just now, in UKM, we observe in 2020, there's some increased numbers of publication, especially in the review papers. I did saw some comments in the chat box just now. They did mention that most of the researchers moved to writing review paper because they get less data, but that is the real thing happens in university, in most of the universities. So we found out that we had an increase in review papers, and also we have to bear in mind review paper invites higher citation to the journal, right? So in fact, we also have doubled up our citation in 2020, right? So we can see, besides that, the best thing is that we also saw some positive trend for the science social to publish in journal, because basically most of the publications will be from science and technology. But last year we found out that our science and science social faculty as well shows an increase in the trends of publications, right? And more research funding, not to say granted, but we receive more research funding proposal. And the comment that we get from the academic, they say they have more time to focus on proposal writing. Maybe before this, they are very much engaged with physical activities, meetings, and that sort of things, right? Number 3, we also have collaborations with industries. So what happens is that, as we know, normally industry, they want results very fast, but this is restricted by the movement MCO and also the lockdown. So the collaborators offers us to bring the sample to their place, right? So we can see that the pandemic actually has bring some in-kind opportunity, like offering manpowers, research equipments, and their facilities. And we can see that it's a good networking between the universities and industries, right? Besides that, we also observe facilities for research was upgraded by the university through several online systems, where sample can be sent at any time to the center and getting response very fast. So actually, I'm bringing on some of the positive things that we observed during the pandemic, right? And also upgraded support system. For example, procedure for purchasing equipments and material can be done through online. Before this, everything is on paper, and during this pandemic, we can see there's a reduce in paper, and we really support the paperless phenomena, right? And also we spend less time to do the purchasing. And also decision and instruction can be decided very fast via online meetings using several platforms like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, WebEx, and etc. Where before this, maybe we have to find some like rooms, and also we have to make an appointment. But during the pandemic, we found that this is more easier to be arranged, right? And also improve network via online webinars, as mentioned by the others. International conference can be held very fast, and we have more time to join the webinars and improve our networking, right? The other thing that we observe that the student monitoring is more regular. Thesis submission can be done. Of course, for masters and PhD thesis, we know they have like 200 to 300 a number of pages of thesis, but then we can save papers. So they're submitting online, and the correction can be made online, right? So this is some of the positive trend that we observe during the pandemic. So as a conclusion, I'm going to give some positive statement, what we gain after the pandemic. Overall, the pandemic actually has unified us and makes us stronger and more creative, solving problems via various solutions. I was attracted by quotes by Pat Riley, as in the slide. If you have a positive attitude and consistently strive to give your best effort, eventually you will overcome your immediate problems and find you are ready for challenges. So I'd like to finish my my slides today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Siti. I think a lot of the things that you mentioned were a common theme throughout all of the presentation in terms of delayed milestones and results in terms of analysis and data, delayed graduations for the students, the different movement control orders. For those of us here in Malaysia, I know it's been very difficult to understand which rules applied to which movement control order. I arrived here in November last year, and I've been in a different form of an MCO ever since. I think it's great, though, that people are getting extensions to their studies and are able to replan their milestones. Fantastic on the increased number of publications overall. more time on the student monitoring. I think that really helps in terms of improving the student experience. And I think, as everybody has commented, the fact that we're all now much more comfortable with using video conferencing and video technology. Even for my own department, before the pandemic, we pretty much relied on teleconferences. We didn't even see each other. But now that is something that's much more common to all of us. And in fact, I'm not sure before the pandemic that we would have been able to do something like this bilateral webinar series. So I think that's a really nice positive outcome of the pandemic as well. All right, I'm going to move now to the Q&A session, the questions and answers session of the webinar. So there was a question, Professor Moynihan, about developing new tools for virtual data collection as a way of supporting research collaboration through the pandemic and beyond. What are the parameters that the universities must adhere to in order to ensure academic integrity is maintained in that context?
That's a good question. I think that any tool that you use for research, we must ensure that it's properly validated and tried and tested before we apply it. And I also think that when we are collecting data virtually, we need to be very careful about the security of those data and ensure that they're stored appropriately. But I mean, there were many we were working towards, in my own area, we were working towards online tools before the pandemic to collect dietary data. But what we've realized now is through using these, how more efficient it is. But of course, these were validated beforehand. And I think other areas now rushing to catch up when we realize we have no alternative but trying to collect these data using virtual tools. So I think to cut it short, ensure that it's validated, tried and tested, and make sure that data storage and exchange is secure. I can't hear you. I think you might be on mute, Fiona.
Sorry, I'm just toggling between controls here. Thanks very much for that, Professor Moynihan. So we have another question, and I'm going to direct this one to you, Professor Patrick. How can we adopt digital health tools to create awareness on COVID-19 or vaccination and communicate with vulnerable groups in Malaysia, for example, migrant workers? And also from the Australian perspective, how can we use the digital health tools to communicate with communities who come from a background where their first language is not English, and from culturally different backgrounds as well?
And thank you for the question. I think the most important point here is for us to consider what are the touch points between the digital platform and the users. So this can be underprivileged users or in the urban area or even in rural areas. For rural areas, of course, there are more challenges, not only culturally or linguistic wise, but also the internet connectivity. So for digital platform to be useful for or more inclusive, I would say in terms of functionality, the digital platform need to be catered for online as well as offline connectivity. Offline means that the apps can still function even though there is no internet connectivity. So when a person moves somewhere with internet connectivity and the data in the apps will be automatically synchronized to the cloud or to the server, and that will in sync or synchronize everything in real time when the internet connectivity is up. Of course, this is technically speaking. Culturally or policy wise, we also need a lot of support for multiple parties in both private and public sectors to really move and make these touch points become convenient and also if possible free for everyone to use, especially for the underprivileged users. So that is my humble experience, and we have done that a little bit in our rural areas and in Sarawak, where Swinburne is situated, where we expand our digital platform to rural areas where they do not have consistent internet connectivity, and we found that the offline functionality of our apps become very handy and convenient use. All right, thank you. Back to
Thanks
you,
very
Fiona.
much, Professor Patrick. I have another question for both you and for Nathan. So Nathan, if you want to answer this one first, could you share tips for cross-disciplinary collaboration? And Professor Patrick, there was a specific question about digital technology scientists and cardiologists not being natural partners and not sharing a similar habitat at work. So how can we reach out to people who are working in other disciplines, and what are the barriers? Nathan, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And it is a bit context dependent, and it is dependent on who the other person is. So in our group, we have people that are actually not generalists. So the different groups that we have are people that don't really go far outside their own speciality. But because of the nature of the research, that's what the clinician wants. They don't want somebody that does a bit in every different ion channel. They want an expert in that specific ion channel. So, but I would have said that, you know, previous to that, we would have spent several years where we found it very hard to strike up collaborations with cross-disciplinary clinicians or scientists, because the demand for us wasn't there. And I think our experience, and this may be terrible advice, but it may be good advice, is to be really, really good at what you're doing. And if you're really, really good at what you're doing, at some point along the way, it's going to be more important. There's going to be that breakthrough of another field where you're needed, and that's when you can reach out to people and you'll see success. But sometimes you're just in an area where, in your field, there doesn't seem to be a practical application. Even though there is, it's just not hot, it's difficult to get money for, and people are more interested in other things, that one patient. Because if you think about our field, most clinicians, most hospitals would see one patient with this disorder in their 20 years. So it's not a priority for them. It's only when we have the whole genome sequencing, we have somebody organising that all of a sudden, yeah, we're really important. So yeah, that's my advice.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, for me, like 13 years ago in 2008, there is no such term called digital health. That was the time that my dear approached cardiologists. As you see, our experience at that time was, for sure, there are a lot of resistance. And of course, terminology or language-wise, in very different disciplines, do not gel well to each other. So that is back to human relationship. That is where I started with, to build rapport, and this rapport is not like sipping coffee and talking. No, not about that. It's about showing what computer science people can do by understanding what cardiologists want. So we start to build a small software prototype for our collaborators to have a look and use and feel the software prototype. To grab more understanding. Both sides, we want to understand cardiologists, and cardiologists also want to understand computer scientists. So that takes years of efforts from both parties to really bridge the barrier. So it's not easy, but we think we are doing well in this field. And slowly we expand to other areas of clinicians, not only cardiology, but also ophthalmologists, eye specialists, and so on. Yeah, it's the same principle. Thank you. Back to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much. Professor Dr. Siti, I have a question for you. What does the postgraduate research student environment look like in Malaysia currently? Because of the delays in graduations, are you seeing the same number of students in the pipeline who wish to become research students, or are people changing their career plans and deciding that they want to work rather than study? I'd be interested in your views on this.
Thank you, Fiona. I think currently, although we have a delay in graduation, as I mentioned to you, but like this year we have, like our institution have picked up Then we have 2 batches of graduation ceremony or convocation for students. But then we found that recently there are a lot more students coming in to continue their studies, because we know that at this pandemic, the economic is low, and like our engineering students, they have maybe they have less job outside there. So we can see there's more requests coming in. But then, of course, we have to balance up with the funding that we have. And we are hoping that the ministry and also other agency will be offering more funding. And as I mentioned to you now, the researchers are really looking forward to write good proposals during the pandemic, have more time for focus, and hoping that this will be a good sign to get more funded and to take more students to reach up or to balance up the one that actually we just lacked for 1 year, right? So in my opinion, we can pick up very fast. Although it's maybe a little bit slower, but still the research is still going on in hybrid modes and still can be continued. Maybe it's not as fast as before pandemic, but with the support of the ministry and university, we are picking up towards, towards a point after the pandemic.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Siti. Professor Moynihan, I'd be interested in your views on this in the Australian context. Are you finding more interest from Australians in undertaking PhD studies? I know that's been a challenge for many universities for many years, particularly in the STEM fields, finding sufficient students to go into PhD programs.
I'm not quite sure whether there's any sort of specific impact of the pandemic, and we see a steady supply of students that want to go into research. I think if I went back to one of the other panelists was talking about being sort of selective about what we research and ensuring that we can future-proof our projects and have a sort of a COVID plan almost, or even a plan to mitigate against other things. I think we need to think more about what projects we offer. But I think definitely the students are still there from Australia, and I don't have a crystal ball to say when things will open up more internationally. But in that meantime, yes, I think we can plan ahead. We can think up some really great projects to do with students, and we'll be ready to go when our borders are more open. Yeah.
Fantastic. I might go to one final question, which is directed to Professor Patrick. You mentioned artificial intelligence and telemedicine. Could you talk about what you see as the ethical limitations on using AI and telemedicine going forward?
AI always have one small issue. It's called trust issue. It can be a big issue. Trust in what way? Let's say a computer scientist develop or train an AI model or algorithms and tested with, let's say, accuracy of 90%, blah, 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 published in some kind of heavy impact journals and so on. And the users, let's say, is medical doctors, they say, well, the AI algorithm is, yes, 95% accurate. So what? Because AI model now still cannot tell or explain why it is 95%. What are the missing 5%? So this brings AI research a bit further now towards the direction which is usually called explainable AI, where it's a bit more prescriptive or descriptive, so that users, when they use AI tools, they will be able, the tool will be presenting them with why is 95%, where are the missing 5%. This is still a very hot and ongoing research in AI. To me, AI is not intended to replace human experts. It's very much to support on this, in a way like saving time for human experts. For example, let's say an eye specialist, ophthalmologist, they have to see thousands of eyes per day, right? in order to, let's say they're in private practice, right? The number of eyes they see per day represent more or less their income. But the question is, the more time they see the eyes, the less time they focus on the patients, the human themselves. When a patient have eye problem, usually there are some kind of reasons or from demographic factor. What are the social activities? What are the profession of the person? And this require a holistic understanding of the patient by the doctor. This kind of diagnosis cannot be met by purely looking at the eyes. Let's say, for example, fundus eyes photos. So AI will be able to save doctors' time by supporting or even replace the repetitive tasks, such as seeing the eye, and to pick up what are the normal and abnormal eyes. And then doctors can zoom in or drill down based on the abnormality picked up by the AI algorithm. So that is where AI is moving towards now. And when this trust issue becomes stronger and stronger, I think ethical will become less issue. Yeah, so ethical approval or acceptance will be a bit more easier for everybody in near future.
Thank you very much for that answer. All right, I'm going to just close the Q&A session now. Thank you very much to all of our panelists today, Professor Moynihan, Dr. Absalom, Professor Patrick, Professor Dr. Sitti. Thank you very much for your incredibly useful and interesting insights on how we can sustain research and research collaboration as we move forward from this global pandemic. Thank you to all of our attendees today. We hope you enjoyed our webinar, and we look forward to seeing some of you again tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. for our final webinar of the series on professional development and employability in the post-COVID-19 era. Take care, stay safe, and terima kasih.